Hello and welcome once again to Economics. In this session we're going to talk a little bit more about the idea of scarcity, and we're going to extend it a little bit by talking about the idea of opportunity cost, which is an economist way of trying to get a grip on exactly how scarce something is. As you probably already guessed, you can kind of make a guess as to how scarce something is in our society based on its price. That is, we know that diamonds are more scarce than water because diamonds have a higher price than water does, and so that gives us a kind of an indication. In some societies there are no prices, and so we have to have another way of thinking about that. From a decision-making standpoint, we really need to be not thinking about dollars and cents as our definition of scarcity or cost, but to be thinking about what it is that we're giving up, what are we foregoing. So from a planning standpoint, it's not so important what the dollar and cent amount is, but what is it that you're having to do without. And so that leads us to the idea of scarcity in terms of opportunity cost. And so our big concept for today is the whole concept of opportunity cost. Scarcity forces us to make a choice. We have to give up something to get something else. In the last session we talked about there is no such thing as a free lunch. So opportunity cost is defined as the value of the best alternative that's foregone. What do you give up in order to get whatever it is you get? And we're going to look at two different examples. The first example is, what does it cost? What is the opportunity cost of a new car? Now, if you ask someone what is the cost of a new car, the first thing that they're going to tell you is it costs $20,475 or something of that sort. Or they might tell you the payment will be X amount. In terms of planning, and this is a big purchase, so you do need to plan it. In terms of planning, you need to think about what are you giving up as a result of this. And it's not just the payment, and it's not just the insurance, and it's not just the maintenance, but you're actually giving up something else. It might mean that you have to wait a little bit longer to get a new house. It might mean that you have to work a little longer because you don't have as much money set aside for retirement. So it's whatever you forego, whatever you do without in order to get this good or service. So notice it has both a monetary aspect and a non-monetary aspect. The monetary aspect is the piece we normally see, and with a name like opportunity cost, it's the piece that we would actually think of. On the other hand, there's a non-monetary aspect as well because you've got to search it out, there's time invested, and so forth. Second example, what is the opportunity cost of going to college? Think for a minute about the possibility of going to college full time and having to devote most of your time and energy to that. Now, if you ask somebody what is the cost of going to college or what does it cost you to go to college, what they're going to quote you is the tuition fees, books, all of that portion of it. And that might run, say, $6,000. So that's what they have to pay in tuition, what they have to pay in fees, what they have to pay in books, and so forth. The more expensive part of it is the foregone income. You could be working at a job and making $20,000 a year working at the job, and so that is that's much bigger than the actual direct cost of college. Now, what most students do is they work at least part-time, and a number of people actually slow down how fast they go through college in order to reduce the opportunity cost of college. So you see here kind of a quick and dirty a little calculation based on a number of assumptions. Here it's the $20,000 you do without. You work part-time, make $10,000, and then you have $6,000 worth of expenses. So rather than the $6,000 being the correct amount for your college per year, it's actually more like $16,000. So notice that the opportunity cost has both a straightforward direct piece, the monetary piece, but it also has a non-monetary piece, and that is the foregone income. And that's precisely why people work part-time or people take an on-campus job or something of that sort in order to reduce that cost. Notice we didn't include room, board, personal expenses, because those things you would have had anyway. Doesn't matter whether you go to school or not, you still got to eat. Doesn't matter whether you go to school or not, you still got to have a place to live and so forth. So we didn't even consider those because they weren't something we were giving up as a result of this decision. Now, notice opportunity cost is very subjective. It depends on who you ask, and it depends on what you didn't do. So it's, by definition, you're kind of guessing at it in a sense. Calculating the opportunity cost often requires a certain amount of time and information, and most of us are pretty lazy, so we don't think about it. So as an example, using our example of the buying a new car, oftentimes we don't think about what it is that we're giving up in order to do it. We only think about what the payment's going to be, or we only think about what the actual cost. Remember that in both cases we actually talked about time, and the ultimate constraint for all of us, the ultimate resource for all of us is time. We only have a limited amount of time. And notice it also varies depending on the circumstances. As an example, using our college example, there are times when that cost, that complete opportunity cost, would be lower. As an example, if the economy is in recession and there are no jobs, the $20,000 is not something you're giving up. You're going to give that up anyway. And we actually observe that in higher education. As an example, during recession, we oftentimes see our enrollment increase, and the reason is because the opportunity cost is lower during that time period. If you're out of a job anyway, you don't have to consider the $20,000 because you weren't going to get that anyway. Now, one thing we never consider is what's known as sunk cost. And these are costs that have already been incurred and can't be recovered. They do not affect our economic choices. So the fact that you have already spent the time and energy for the first 2 years of college doesn't affect your decision making on the last 2 years of college. It's not relevant. It's a sunk cost. That money is gone. That cost has already been incurred, and so we don't consider it. But we are back to a concept we talked about last time, and that is marginal benefit with marginal cost. What we will do in deciding on the last 2 years of college is we will think, what would the benefit be if I complete those 2 years, and what would the cost be for those 2 years? We compare the benefit with the cost, and if the benefit exceeds the cost, then we'll undertake those last 2 years. And that's precisely why the further you go in your college education, the more likely it is that you'll complete it. Because the marginal benefit never changes, but the marginal cost does change. After you've invested 2 years in your education, the additional cost to complete a four-year education is at least half as much. And so the benefit remains the same, but the cost is smaller. So we go ahead and complete. Now, this leads us to the law of comparative advantage. And comparative advantage says that we will specialize in the task that we do best, because the opportunity cost of doing the other is so much higher. So if we're particularly good at typing but not so good at ironing shirts, then we will type and hire somebody else to iron our shirts. And the result of that is it lowers our opportunity costs, and it leads us to specialization. It is much wiser for us to do the typing for somebody who likes to iron, and let them iron your shirts and their shirts, and you do their typing as well. The result is both of you are better off, because you can get more typing done than the combination of the two of you, and they can get more ironing done than the combination of the two of you. And so the two of you will specialize and exchange your production between the two of you, and both of you will be better off. We do that in the economy as a whole as well as individuals. Originally, economies are barter economies. Very simple economies. The people who produce the products they produce the complete product, and they simply exchange them. So you would have a baker would exchange his bread with the cheesemaker, and there's no specialization. But the result of that is there's very few goods. And the goods that do occur, while they may be high in quality, are very small in number. Naturally, what ultimately will arise is money, and money facilitates the exchange and allows everybody to specialize. And so we'll see a wider array of products. The products will get less expensive, and we'll use the money to exchange between the two. One of the problems with barter is that it requires a double coincidence of wants. In other words, if we're going to make an exchange, I've got to have what you want, and you've got to have what I want. And in that sort of a system, we can't specialize much, because if I don't happen to know someone who makes the product that I want, then I can't make an exchange. So as money naturally arises, it allows us to all specialize, and the result of that specialization is that products become cheaper, we get a wider variety, we get a whole different variety in terms of quality and so forth, and so we're all better off. So the naturally arising money causes us to all be better off, and it causes us to all be able to participate in division of labor. Division of labor is simply the breaking of a job into many smaller parts. So as an example, instead of being a cobbler and making an entire pair of shoes, we would specialize. So we'd have one person who cuts out the leather, we'd have another person who sews the leather together, we'd have a third person who sews the soles on, and so forth. This is called specialization. It's done for a couple of reasons, but the primary reason, the reason it ultimately wins, is because it increases our productivity. As people do a particular part of it, as the guy who does nothing but cut out the leather does it more and more, he gets better and better at it. As the guy who does nothing but sewing does it more and more, he gets better and better at it. It might also be the case that that's his preference. He likes to sew, but he doesn't care anything about cutting it out. He doesn't care anything about putting on soles. Or perhaps he has a natural ability to sew. He's just particularly dexterous with his hands or something of that sort. And so as a result, we get more productive and more efficient. As he does it more and more, he figures out better and better ways to do it. And so as a result, he gets more and more efficient, and probably also gets higher and higher quality as a result. It's also the case that we get more productive because we don't have to shift between tasks. He doesn't have to stop sewing and start cutting out another piece of leather. He doesn't have to stop sewing and put the sole on. And it's also the case that he oftentimes can begin to use machinery. It's worth his while to have a sewing machine to sew the pieces together because that's all he does is sew the pieces together. Downside of it, it's repetitive, it gets routine, it gets tedious. It's fun right to begin with, but after you've done it day after day after day, you get tired of doing it, and perhaps you don't even think about it anymore. In our society, ultimately, these routine sorts of tasks are done by machines, or more modernly are done by robots, and so as a result, we do away with the repetitive nature and the tedious nature of it. Now, the idea of opportunity cost leads us naturally to a thing that's a kind of a fundamental idea in economics. It's called the production possibilities frontier. It's also sometimes referred to as production possibilities curve. And it's simply an attempt at modeling the maximum levels of production for two goods or two services and how we can go about making our decision about the combinations which are possible for us. So what we want to do is we want to think about a process or think about a situation in which there are two goods or two services, and how would we decide between how many of one and how many of the other that we end up producing? Remember, it's production possibilities frontier. So you could think about, well, how many loaves of bread and how many cakes can we make with our bakery, and what would be the blend between those? How would they compare as we move from one to the other? Now, you may be thinking, well, production, typically we'd produce more than two products. And all of the ideas that we use here can be extended and can, in fact, go to 3, 4, 5 products, or as many products as you have. Unfortunately, the graph gets a little bit complicated when we go beyond 2. So we simplify to only 2 products in order to make it easy for us to draw and to come to some conclusions about what's going to happen. So let's talk about a particular use of this and some of the assumptions that underlie it. And the particular one that we're going to look at is what happens in the economy as a whole as we make our choices between consumer goods and capital goods. So what assumptions are we going to make? We're going to assume there are only 2 goods. You're either producing consumer goods or you're producing capital goods. We're looking at the production for a single year. In that year, we only have a certain amount of resources, both in their quantity and their quality. The technology that's available to us is fixed, and the rules of the game are fixed. And so if we look at that, we're going to look at all of the possible combinations of the 2 goods that can be produced, and we're going to look and see where are the efficient combinations and where are the inefficient combinations. So we might end up with a drawing that looks something like this. Here we're looking at the production of millions of units of consumer goods and millions of units of capital goods. And you see along this curve, and this is a PP frontier, but you see along this curve you see various different combinations. So combination C, as an example, is 43 million units of consumer goods and 20 million units of capital goods. If you move to production level D, we have 34 million units of consumer goods and 30 million units of capital goods. Now, first thing you should notice about that is as we increase the amount of one good, we lose production in terms of the other good. And it turns out not only do we lose production, but as we're going to see in a second, under certain circumstances, we may lose a lot as a result of it. All of the points you see identified here and all of the ones in between them are said to be efficient production. So points A, B, C, D, E, and F are all efficient production, which essentially means that given the quantity of resources that we have available and given the technology that we have available, that's as good as it's going to get. Point I, however, is said to be inefficient. At point I, we only produce 20 million units of consumer goods and 20 million units of capital goods. Notice we could move either to point C or point D. Point D would be a really good point to move to, because if we move to D, we would get more consumer goods and more capital goods. Typically, the way this happens in a macroeconomic situation is that we have unemployed resources. We're not using all the resources that are available to us. And so it's an inefficient point. Point U, on the other hand, is unattainable. It's outside of our choices or our possibilities. We can't get to U because we don't have enough resources to get to U. Now, 2 important things for us to see about this, 2 important characteristics for us to see about this PP frontier is, and we just have mentioned one of them, and that is we can't get out to U because we don't have enough resources to get out to U. We'd have to have more factors of production. We'd have to have more land, more labor, more capital, more entrepreneurial ability. Something would have to increase in order for us to get out there. Another important point for us to see is that this line is not straight. which means the trade-off between consumer goods and capital goods is not constant. As we move from one point to the other, the amount we're giving up changes. And this is known as the law of increasing opportunity cost. As we move from one point to the other, the opportunity cost, and remember here the opportunity cost is what we're giving up of the other good, changes and ultimately will increase. So as I move from producing more as I move to produce more consumer goods, I have to give up capital goods, and ultimately I'll have to give up more and more capital goods to get a little bit more. So let's look at 2 points here. If you look at going from point D to point C, I pick up roughly 9 million units of consumer goods going from D to C, and I give up 10 million units of capital goods to get there. But notice as we go from C to B, I only get 5 additional million units of consumer goods, but I still give up 10 million units of capital goods. So the opportunity cost of going from C to B is higher than the opportunity cost of going from D to C. Now the natural question is, why does it work that way? What occurs to cause that to be the case? And the answer is that while we think of resources generically, that is, we think of resources in categories, the truth of the matter is resources are not equally good at producing different things. So we start out using resources that are particularly good at making consumer goods and resources that are particularly good at making capital goods to produce consumer goods and to produce capital goods. But ultimately, as we produce more and more consumer goods, we have to use resources which were better suited to make capital goods to make consumer goods. Now that's an awful lot of work, so let's think about that for a minute. Suppose we were looking at a farm and we were riding with a farmer, and the farmer took us around to see the various different fields. What he would describe to us is the attributes of the various different fields. So he might point to a field and say, that's a great corn field. And what he means by that is that if you grow corn on that particular field, it has a very high yield. Then he might take you to another field and say, that's a great soybean field, which means that if you grow soybeans on that field, that you get a particularly high yield of soybeans. On the other hand, suppose he decides one year that he's going to grow all corn. And if he does so, obviously the first place he'll plant will be the corn field. But sooner or later, he'll have to plant the soybean field. Now we know that the soybean field is not as productive at growing corn as it is at growing soybeans, but now we've pressed it into service. And so the loss in terms of soybeans is higher than it would be if we had devoted it to soybeans. And that's exactly what we're seeing on the PP frontier. That's exactly why it has the shape that it has, is because the opportunity cost is changing. The opportunity cost is actually increasing as a result of our specialization in one particular thing. So as we move up that PP frontier to more and more consumer goods, we have to give up more and more capital goods to get there. And so that's referred to as the law of increasing opportunity cost. Again, it only occurs because resources are not equally adept at producing the different products. Now, we also need to recognize one characteristic that we talked about a second ago, and that is that the PP frontier is positioned where it is due to the resource availability. We might want to ask the question, how could we increase it? How could we shift that curve out? We can't do anything about the shape, but how could we shift it out? Well, one way of shifting it out would be to increase the size, that is the number of people in the labor force, or the health of the labor force. Or we could increase the amount of capital that was available to us. Notice we're kind of making the assumption that we can't do a whole lot about the amount of land that's available to us. Or we could change the technology. Remember, we made the assumption that the technology is not changeable, but if we were to develop technology, we would employ that in order to get more product out of the same resources, or we could change the rules of the game to make an improvement. And the rules of the game are the institutions that determine how we produce goods and services, and it too could shift out the PP frontier. So if we were to have an increase in resources, then we would see the PP frontier move from, we've got it drawn here, the darker one, A to F. We would have it shift from A to F to A prime to F prime. So this is an example where we've had an increase in labor, or we've had an increase in capital that's available to us. Could be an increase in land, although we didn't talk about that one. In panel B here, we've actually had a decrease in available resources. So we've got less workers, or we've got less capital, or something of that sort. On the other hand, if we were to change the technology, change the ability to produce the same amount, it typically does not move symmetrically. Typically, technological changes will benefit one particular category more than it does the other. So here we don't get a parallel shift. What we get is one is benefited and the other is not benefited as much. Now, what did we mean by rules of the game? Rules of the game are one of the ways that, especially in our society, we attempt to do economic development. And it has to do with how easy it is to do business, or what's often referred to as the business climate. A friendly business climate typically results in a high standard of living and causes a very sophisticated economy. On the other hand, a difficult business climate typically results in a lower standard of living and a very poor economy. So if you look around the world and you see certain economies are not doing so well, one of the explanations may be that it's pretty hard to do business there. And here you see examples of rated according to the World Bank, places that are easy to do business in and places that are very hard to do business in. And if you look at these two lists, one of the things that should strike you is all of the ones on the right-hand side are all places where the standard of living for the members of those societies are pretty low. And when you look at the ones on the left-hand side, you should be thinking, well, the standard of living is pretty darn good in those places. And the reason for that is because there's a tremendous investment. Businesses are willing to place their capital there. They're willing to make investments there. And so as a result, the standard of living rises in those places. And so what are some of the things that you can do? What are some of the rules of the game? Well, if you sell an imported product in Denmark, it takes 3 documents, 1 official signature, and 5 days for approval. On the other hand, in Burundi, it takes 19 documents, 55 signatures, and averages 24 days. Obviously, if you're considering, should I sell my product in Denmark or should I sell my product in Burundi, the sheer hassle would keep you from wanting to sell it in Burundi. And so as a result, the people who live in society in Burundi are not going to have as wide a choice of products as they would have in Denmark. Similarly, business taxes in Belarus, there are 11 taxes which represent 122% of profit, 113 tax payments to 3 separate government agencies, average about 1,200 hours per year in tax preparation. In Hong Kong, there are only 2 taxes. 14% of profits is the maximum tax level. You file electronically, and it takes you about 80 hours per year. You don't want to go into business in Belarus because look at what happens. Potentially, you could lose money doing business in Belarus, because 122% of profit means that you actually pay them to sell things in their country. So obviously you would want to avoid Belarus. And this is precisely why Hong Kong is such a center of economic activity, especially international economic activity. One of the things that we underestimate in our country is how important the legal system is. The legal system in East Timor, suppose you need to collect a $1,000 debt, somebody owes you $1,000 and you have to take them to court. In East Timor, it costs $1,800 in court and attorney fees, takes 69 procedures, and it'll take approximately 3 years to collect it. In Denmark, on the other hand, it'll cost $65. There are only 15 procedures, and it takes about 6 months to collect it. Again, obviously, you wouldn't want to do business in East Timor because it's going to cost you more to collect the $1,000 than you're going to get. So you would want to avoid it. And one of the things that we underestimate in this country, one of the great geniuses of our system, and obviously we inherited it from the English and the French, but one of the great geniuses of our system, one of the things that we never think about that's vitally important is there are two systems within our legal system. There's both the civil system and a criminal system. In many countries, there's only a criminal system. So if someone perpetrates fraud on you, you've got to depend upon someone to investigate it. You've got to depend upon the DA to prosecute it, and then it's got to go through the court system and so forth. If the person who perpetrates that fraud happens to be related or can somehow manage to affect those decision makers, then it doesn't get prosecuted. Under our system, if you feel like you've been fraudulently treated, you don't have to rely on someone to prosecute it. You can bring charges yourself. You can sue them in order to get retribution or however you want to put that. Now, we oftentimes whine and complain about people suing about things, but it's a great genius of our system that you don't have to rely on someone else to prosecute for you. You can do it yourself. And that's precisely why we get so much investment is there's a feeling of protection. There's a feeling that your money is protected and that you have rights and the authority yourself to take care of it. So why is the business environment so bad in some other countries? Well, first off, they have bad administrative systems. It's often the case that government jobs are considered as favoritism or the spoils of war. When you win election, you place all of your family in governmental jobs, and so as a result, they don't really care, nor is it necessary for them to care about doing a good job. It is frequently the case in many underdeveloped countries that corruption is rampant, that bribes are a necessity in order to accomplish anything you want to accomplish. And so as a result, the system doesn't work very well to protect people. And so as a result, the economy does not develop very well. So what do we learn from the PPF? What do we learn from the production possibilities frontier? We learn that efficiency is achievable, but it requires our planning, our know-how in order to get there. We also got from it the law of increasing opportunity cost and the fact that if we push production in one direction or the other, that there's not only going to be an opportunity cost, but there's going to be an increasing opportunity cost. And we also learned that in order to gain or grow, ultimately we have to get new or additional resources in order to increase our productive capacity. And so as a result, it encourages us, I believe, to accumulate capital, essentially, which is, by the way, why we call ourselves capitalist, because that's an important point for us. Now, all societies need to answer three basic questions: what, how, and for whom. Let me expand on those a little bit. What means, what goods and services do we produce? Remember, we're all about choices. that we've discovered economies have to make choices and decide to produce this but not produce that. And so the first question is, what will we produce? The second question is, how will we produce it? Turns out once we've decided what goods to produce, we actually have a choice about how we go about producing it and what's the most efficient way and what's the best possible way. And finally, the third question is, for whom? Who gets it once it's produced? Now, the economic system is the series of institutions and mechanisms which cause us to answer those questions. Either by design or by default, all countries have to have a system which answers those questions. There are two ways of looking at that. The first, and the one that economists look at as the most important, is who owns the resources. Because the people who own the resources are the people who determine its allocation. That is, the owners, to a certain extent, determine what goods and services will be made, and even to a certain extent how they will be made, and what is the whole series of incentives that cause those decisions to be made and that encourage certain decisions and discourage other decisions. Now, the range is between pure capitalism and a pure command system. So what's the difference between a pure command system and a pure capitalist system? In a pure command system, someone is charged with the responsibility of answering those three questions. So there's someone who has the responsibility of determining what goods and services will be produced, how they'll be produced, and for whom. So if you go back as an example to the old USSR, there was an entire bureaucracy, there was an entire department whose sole responsibility was to determine what goods and services would be produced and who would produce them and so forth. So there's someone whose responsibility was to determine how many shoes, how many boots, what color, which factories will they be made in, and so forth. And so they would determine all the goods and services that were to be produced, and then they would give orders or commands to all of the underlying plants and responsible managers and so forth. So the manager of a shoe factory would get a call that would say, you're to manufacture X number of shoes and X number of boots in the following sizes and the following colors, and the leather is on its way to you, and you've already got the people working for you that are supposed to work for you. Obviously, that's kind of an alien concept for us in the United States. So how do we determine it? Well, we determine it through a market, which simply means that if you want to encourage the shoe manufacturer to make more brown shoes, then you buy brown shoes. If you want to discourage them from making black shoes, then you don't buy black shoes. And so the result of that is that we get the things that we have encouraged them to do. We encourage them to produce them in such a fashion that it's very efficient. And so that answers the how. And the for whom is determined by who has the money. Whoever has the money are the people who end up with the goods and services. And so we're a capitalist system, we're a market-based system, which determines all of these decisions. Now, under pure capitalism, individuals have property rights. Individuals own all of the resources, and individuals answer the three questions. The goods that are produced are the most valued goods. There is voluntary buying and selling. And in 1776, Adam Smith wrote a book in which he said, the invisible hand determines what's to be produced. And essentially what he meant was the market guides the producers to produce certain products and guides them not to produce others. Now, there are problems with that, however. One problem is that there's no central authority. One of the advantages of having a planning system is you're always moving in the same direction. But as we've said before, people have a tendency to change their minds about things, and so as a result, we might make brown shoes for a while, and then we might decide, no, we like black shoes instead. People with no resources have no say. And ultimately, under pure capitalism, people with no resources would actually starve. Under pure capitalism, we have a tendency to create monopolies, which is a single producer of a good or service for which there is no ready substitute. So what happens is we get more and more concentration, and this is precisely what Karl Marx was writing about when he fathered socialism and communism. There are side effects sometimes for people that are not involved in the transaction, and this is known as an externality. That is, people who, you may make a transaction with someone and it may have the side or consequence of affecting someone who's not a party to the transaction. And capitalism does not have any way of producing public goods, where public goods are goods or services for which consumption by one person does not preclude consumption by another person. And you may be wondering, well, exactly what would that be? Well, the best example of that is a road. With a road, when I use the road, it doesn't preclude you from using the road. And pure capitalism cannot produce that kind of good. Primary reason it can't is because it can't price it. It can't figure out what to charge for it because it doesn't know how many people are going to actually be using it. So you'll note that there are a lot of things produced in our society produced by government, and the reason they are is because they're public goods. They would not be produced otherwise. Under a pure command system, you have public or communal ownership of the property. Public ownership or governmental ownership is known as socialism. Communal ownership is known as communism. Public ownership or government ownership of all the factors of production is different from communal ownership. Communal ownership means that everyone owns a piece of it, or we all own it together is one way of looking at that. You have a central plan to direct the resources and coordinate production. As I said, communism is a variant of this. Both of them are the result of the thinking of Karl Marx, and they've been extended somewhat from his original ideas. But the idea essentially is, or the major thing that Karl Marx was writing about, was the idea that power would be concentrated under a capitalistic system. What are some of the flaws of a command system? Well, it's terribly inefficient. The resources have no incentive to be productive. There's no reason for you to want to work because you don't receive any more if you want to work. You don't receive any less if you don't work. It typically results in the preferences of the planners being exhibited. That is, if you particularly like boots instead of shoes, then you're going to command everyone to do boots instead of shoes. There's less freedom of choice, less variety of products, and it's also the case that it oftentimes is the case that the people who make the decisions end up with the products. Since they also make the decision about who receives the product, they oftentimes end up with the product, and that's their decision making. It's kind of, in some ways, it's a much more traditional system, although typically communistic and socialistic thinkers think of it as a very modern system, a very new system, an improved capitalistic system. It's actually a traditional system because if you go back to pre-industrial societies, essentially whoever was in charge made those decisions. So the king made that decision, or the prince, or whomever the local authority was made all of those decisions. And so as a result, it is actually a much more traditional system. Now, our system is not uniquely capitalistic. It's not completely capitalistic. Kind of made that point a second ago when we were talking about public goods. It's actually a mixed system. And all societies are mixed systems. Planned societies, for the most part, planned economic systems have some components of capitalism, as indeed ours has some components of socialism and communism. In our society, there are some industries that are owned by the government. Defense is a good example of that. You don't get to determine how many new missiles there'll be and how many new planes there'll be, because that is a socialist component of our economic system. There are also some communistic components of it. National parks is a good example of a piece that's held in common. It's owned by all of us. The National Mall is held in common. It's owned by all of us. It's not owned by the government. It's not owned by individuals. So all societies are mixed in nature. One of the trends that we see is both are moving more toward the middle. In capitalistic economies, we're seeing larger and larger role of government. In planned economies, we're seeing larger and larger role for markets. And in fact, there are very few truly planned economies anymore. Government is also regulating the private sector in both cases. And I always tend to forget that there are some economies that are regulated more by custom, that is prior behavior, or by religion than any other way. And so we see a lot of capitalistic societies, as an example, especially in Asia, in which family ties determine who deals with who and who does business with whom and that sort of thing. Or the old traditional ways don't die out so easily. So some societies have sort of kind of planning, but not really planning. It's just the custom. Well, that was a whole hodgepodge of ideas, but all of them are related in a fashion. And that kind of wraps us up in terms of the background things that we need to have in order to talk about what goes on in the future. I'll see you again next time. Good to have you with us.